Hey everybody, welcome to today's mini booth gathering. It's good to be with you, whatever that means under the circumstances. Author Kathleen Norris has written a book called Acedia and Me. Acedia is a word that probably most of us don't know, a word that was common around the medieval period, so that might explain why we don't know it. Sort of a word that, a little bit hard to define, but basically a word that's an attempt to talk about how it feels when we want to care about spiritual things, but we can't. We just, even if we try, we can't quite do it. So that's where that title comes from. She opens the book with a story about a 4th century monk named Abba Paul. Paul was one of what we would now call the desert fathers and mothers. It's a group of people who looked around at their prevailing society and the norms of that society, thought this is not conducive to spiritual growth and formation, and they left. They actually moved out of town. They went and literally lived in the desert in isolation for the most part to practice lives of spiritual formation, of the disciplines that would help them grow in their connection with God. So for them, that was study, it was prayer, it was contemplation. And so that's what they did. Now, one of the things that they had to wrestle with in that process was the relationship between what we might call spiritual work, things that are about that kind of formation, and physical work, what they did with their hands, with their bodies. We might be doing a little wrestling of our own these days about the nature of work and our relationship with work. If you're a student, you might be feeling stressed about the fact that the job you had lined up now doesn't seem to exist, that the source of income you were anticipating is dried up, and that can lead to concerns about how am I going to manage next year, how am I going to manage the debt that I already have, and can I go back to school, and all this whole bundle of things. If you're already in the workforce, then the odds are at least pretty fair that you're dealing with either loss of work or reduced work or changed work, and those are all stressful experiences too. So our relationship with work these days is probably a little bit complicated and a little bit stressful. In the midst of all of that, it might be easy to kind of lose track of the connection between our embodied work and what's going on with our spirits. And this is where this story about Abba Paul, this 4th century monk, comes back into things. Paul, like lots of the desert monks, actually did some physical work. Some of what they did to live. In Paul's case, he had his own garden, and he lived off the things he grew in his garden, and he collected some date palms in the area. Lots of monks, in addition to that, had some kind of sort of regular work that they did for their own practices and their own purposes. Lots of them wove baskets. That's what Paul did. He wove palm frond baskets, kind of all day, every day, while he prayed and contemplated and studied. He wove these baskets. Now, interesting thing about Paul's story is that his hermitage, his cave, was a long ways away from any other habitable land or town or city. In his case, he lived about a 7-day journey from any of those kind of situations. So even if he could find someone who could transport him to a town where he could sell his baskets, let's say, the money that he would get for his baskets would be less than what it would cost him to get them to market. And so he wasn't weaving his baskets for money, but he put in a full day's work every day as though that were the case, as though this was actually his material livelihood. Now, we might already think that's a bit of an odd story. Why would you work if you weren't getting paid? That's the way we tend to think about work these days, which leaves a lot of things out, but that's another topic. But in any case, this strange story just gets stranger because once Paul had a year's worth of baskets in his cave, he had a basket bonfire and he burned them all. He torched the whole lot of them, and then he started over. Now, what's that about? Because that's very, very strange. Some possibilities. Maybe Paul's like a super monk. He really gets it about this thing that his life of prayer and contemplation actually matters more than anything he could make or do. Maybe this is just about that. Maybe he's sort of a 4th century prototypical performance artist and methodically destroying these things that he has so meticulously made is an act that dramatizes the fact that it's the process of making something that's more valuable than the thing that we make. We're formed in the making, and the product is not so consequential. Maybe that. Maybe he's just been alone too much, and this is not an entirely rational act. Okay? Those are all possibilities. The monk who wrote down this story in the 4th century, John Cassian, who wrote a collection of works called the Institutes, in which this story is found, says something else. He says this. He says that Paul's act of burning his year's work, quote, aided the monk in purging his heart, firming his thoughts, persevering in his spiritual disciplines, and renewing his desire to care about matters of the spirit, at which point Cassian uses the word acedia to describe that renewal of care or the loss of care. Now, what's that got to do with us today and the things we might be stressed about work and how we're relating to work these days? I'm not suggesting we should all run out and destroy what we've done, or we should sabotage our future work possibilities or something like that, although every once in a while, after I've had too many Zoom meetings, I sort of want to take my laptop and just, toss it in the creek. But I think that story, combined with our present circumstances, might prompt some important questions about the relationship between our physical work, our material work, and our spiritual work. Maybe questions like, what do I think is the relationship between the work that I do with my body and my hands and the work that I do with my spirit, my heart work, my deep interior work? How does my stress about work these days inform my values? How does it inform my imagination or my thoughts about what matters most? Had a mentor once say to me that you can tell what you trust by looking at what you fear, and that's always stuck with me. When I feel afraid that I'm going to lose my work, what does that say about where I'm placing my trust? It's an interesting question. Question like, how can I try to face the challenges work might present these days in ways that would deepen my relationship with God? So how can I wrestle with these exact things in ways that are spiritually deepening for me? And how can I stir up my heart with these challenges? How can I have a moment of this kind in history sort of shake me up in good ways regarding how I think about the work that I do with my body and the work that I do with my spirit and how those things are connected? There's probably lots of other questions too, but there's some starters. Maybe these 4th century desert fathers and mothers, these people who ran out to the desert and made these radical spiritual choices, and they did that at a point in history where the economy wasn't exactly booming for them either, maybe these folks still have something to teach us. It's up to each of us to explore, but I think it's worth a shot. Peace.